And I know that office politics can be extremely stressful. When I first went into the office environment, like I had said earlier, I refused to participate in it. I thought it was a waste of time. I thought that it was somewhat of a boys' game, and that it was fake, and that my performance was going to speak for itself and my contributions were going to speak for myself. And that, that just isn't the case.
Experiencing office politics is an inevitable part of the workplace, and avoiding it is not an option. Rather, developing political competence is a necessity. The challenge is learning how to even manage and eventually master it. And that starts with understanding politics is all about relationships at its core.
And once you have a good understanding of the interplay, if you will, amongst those relationships, then you're well positioned to understand the level of influence that politics may or may not have on any given day. Once you learn some of these fundamentals, the earlier that you learn them, we all know, the better, because then over time you can be that partner and really, support each other in an organization or on a team at work to get the best work done.
So what are those fundamentals, and how do we handle those tricky situations that we all commonly find ourselves in? Welcome to the Strategic Momentum Podcast, the show where we share tips, stories, and advice from progressive leaders on how to break through business and career inertia so you can better understand the business of work. I'm your host, Connie Steele. A few weeks ago, we started our conversation on office politics by digging into what it is, as well as the root causes of political behavior. A panel of business leaders joined me to share their individual experiences with and perspectives on politicking in the workforce. We unpacked how one's deep-seated emotions, especially fear and the need to be liked, can manifest in a me versus we mindset. But we also discovered that sometimes it's not the individuals, rather the power dynamics, leadership styles, and reward structures in an organization that creates and reinforces office bureaucracies. Plus, we learned how politics and behaviors that go along with it, in fact, are not all negative. Today, we're moving into part 2 by looking at various solutions and courses of action you could take to mitigate, manage, or navigate the politics more effectively. Joining me today again are Kimberly Henning, SVP of Enterprise Payments at Bank of America, Preston Lewis, founder and CEO of Intactic, Tony Orlando, software executive and board member to several tech companies, Jennifer Trespass, or JT, partner and COO of Wildcat Venture Partners, Jim McDonald, Chief Client Officer at VML Y&R Agency, and Jim Brady, founder and CEO of Spirited Media Consulting. In this episode, we explore what it takes to manage common political situations and how to build those skills that can help you anticipate and maneuver those tricky situations and circumstances in the future. We'll start by revisiting what office politics really is.
It really can start with an individual, but it can evolve into the culture. And politics, from the way that I perceive it within the workplace, is really an individual interacting with others.
The way I would define it is the interplay of relationships that happen within any kind of organizational culture.
Politics is a form of relationship management. It's nurturing relationships to help you achieve something for yourself. And that is, or to even just neutralize, but still be visible or influencing.
Many of us associate politics with the negative political behaviors such as backstabbing, exclusion, and manipulation. But we can't forget there are positive behaviors as well, which Tony shared in our previous episode.
The positive side of politics is, when you really believe in something, or you know unequivocally you've got the right answer, it can be a struggle to have people, one, hear you, and then two, adopt your position, your recommendation, whatever it might be. And that's where the power of what I would call positive influence politics or influential politics comes to bear.
Being able to motivate others to act towards achieving a common goal can lead to the success of a team, organization, or company. And that technically is politics. But as we all know, most don't like to play that political game at all. JT tells us, however, you have to embrace it because learning how to play and then master the game is an important skill.
I embraced it. So a couple of things is that instead of fighting it, complaining about it, resisting it, it was figuring out, how do I learn from this? What are the behaviors that they're demonstrating that I can model, that I can feel comfortable with in my own value system and still maintain my integrity? How can I engage in this authentically for myself without feeling fake? And I don't want this to happen to others. So how do I participate in this to then give it forward and show advocacy in a way that feels positive versus exclusive or negative? It's humbling. It is one where you have to bite the bullet at times, but it is part of how you have to navigate, whether it's women supporting women or just general office politics in general. You do have to engage in this, and it doesn't have to be that intimidating to go through it, but you have to have some courage to embrace it and build a skill around it.
So it's interesting that you talk about building a skill, which starts with observing and learning, and almost, if I could summarize, it's somewhat creating a plan. You're creating a plan for helping you identify that end goal that you're looking to do, and understanding all of the different pieces and parts, whether they are a person, whether it's a behavior, whether it's some outcomes that you want, but understanding their interconnectivity. And based on that, that can help start to build the foundation for a roadmap aligned to your values in order to get you where you want to go.
Exactly. It does not have to be overwhelming. And I know that office politics can be extremely stressful. When I first went into the office environment, like I'd said earlier, I refused to participate in it. I thought it was a waste of time. I thought that it was somewhat of a boys' game, and that it was fake, and that my performance was going to speak for itself and my contributions were going to speak for myself. And that, that just isn't the case. And it can be very stressful of, wow, there's all this activity going on that you're not participating in. And even though you view it as wasteful, like, wait a minute, this is something I have to participate in. And so how do you do it in a way that is not overwhelming? It can be, as you pointed out, just those steps and putting together a plan. And it's not something that is a check the box. I know a lot of people just tell me the answer, let me check the box, and I'll do it very quickly.
By understanding the ecosystem by which decisions get made, you are then able to think through a strategic plan to help you address your problem. So it's important to understand those strategies and tactics to help you accomplish your objectives and get to your end goal. We can start to understand this ecosystem by first learning about power in the workplace and the impact it fundamentally has on people, behavior, culture, and even the work that gets done. When it comes to relationships, there's often a situation of power in the workplace. Power can be used to get a job done or motivate a team to accomplish extraordinary things, but we also know it can be used for the wrong reasons. And many are familiar with that saying, it's not the knowledge or skills you possess, it's about who you know. And that rings true in many organizations. The power play and political behaviors stemming from it are all about being noticed and liked by the right people, the powers that be, to be able to get the right promotions and influence at the right time. Power may be defined as the ability, capability, or right to be able to control people or things. Preston describes it another way.
I think a simple definition is the ability to influence decision making.
And we all know that the behavior and actions of those at the top impact all levels who report into them. And that trickle-down effect creates negative consequences, but also positive ones, particularly on the culture. Kimberly explains.
Behavior at the top gives permission to people who trickle down from the top. And I think that that's one of the most important things that leaders need to understand, is that what they put out is going to intentionally or unintentionally influence the rest of the organization. You can take Uber, for instance. I think Uber is a really good example of office politics, and how when the former CEO was in place and Travis would demonstrate a culture of severe politics and actually demand that people act and behave the same way as he did. And now that that has been removed from Uber, the culture of that company has significantly changed in accordance with its new CEO, where always be hustling and get the deal done for the sake of getting the deal done, regardless of the casualties, is now a much more positive culture because those political elements have removed. That doesn't mean that you're a victim to those politics, because if you are a leader, you have the ability to shape your team. And you have the ability to also demonstrate a different type of politics to be able to stop in its tracks some of the negative politics that could be coming from the top. That being said, it's not going to be the panacea, because other organizations within your company may not be operating in that level, and they may not have any type of shelter from power politics that are coming from the top. This, of course, is assuming that those power politics are negative. There are several organizations that have power politics coming from the top, but those are power politics for good and power politics for helping to define the culture in a very positive way. I can speak firsthand in how Brian Moynihan at Bank of America exudes his power politics of not every dollar is a good dollar, that the clients come first in everything that we do. And that helps shape how the rest of the organization thinks about interacting with each other, as well as down the road, how our clients then also think about us and how the public thinks about us. Because as I've mentioned before, politics are something that not only makes a company on the inside, but it also can help form public opinion on the outside.
So how do you deal with those situations where you have this follow the leader behavior, particularly when it's negative? Or maybe you're struggling in terms of your relationship with your manager. Preston conveys the need to first understand the context from which this leader is operating.
I think there's a level of understanding of the relationship between, what's happening between people and teams within the broader organization. And once you have a good understanding of the interplay, if you will, amongst those relationships, then you're well positioned to understand the level of influence that politics may or may not have on any given day.
Once you have an understanding of the context, the concerns, priorities, measures of success, then you'll want to engage with their leader in a dialogue. But remember, timing is important, and it's all about asking for permission.
Often when we think about relationships, and obviously this is directly connected to politics, the key word is permission. And I like to, when we coach people at all stages of their career, one place that we start is, so it's, I'm having a difficult time with my manager, or, leadership is challenging. It's asking for the permission to provide feedback, rather than saying, can I give you some feedback? That's one way of asking. Or another way of asking the same question is, can I have permission to give you some perspective, or to share some perspective, or to share some feedback even? You either do or you do not have permission. And again, when you can use the right language and vocabulary to frame the conversation and create a safe context for the conversation, it's a lot easier. And so really, whether it's at the leadership level or whether it's at any level, people need to have permission to share their perspective, to share that feedback and share those thoughts. And I really like that word permission, because when we talk about accountability, if leaders are looking to really make an impact or a difference in that culture and address politics, for example, they do need to give permission to people at all levels in any role to have the right conversations at the right time. That's another important thing. One of my favorite things is, the right conversation at the wrong time is the wrong conversation. If you're having a feedback around politics or what's not working or what is working at the wrong time, then just don't have it. Wait for another time. What
Absolutely.
what leaders and often people, communicators, people that are in a position to determine, frankly, when is the right time or the wrong time to have certain conversation. They need to be aware of both, again, timing and do people feel comfortable, or do feel as though they do have the space or permission to speak their mind and speak the truth.
I think it's a great point. Folks haven't mentioned that as a critical sign to look for in evaluating the dynamics of not just the interplay of people, but the individual themselves and what they may be going through personally, to know if a certain moment in time might be the right opportune moment to kind of tee up something where they're more receptive to it. Because everybody has a certain period where they're going to be incredibly defensive and they're never going to hear you. So even if you ask for permission, they're going to say no just because they're coming from an emotional standpoint. And I just love that point that you had, where when you first ask for permission, you're actually addressing that point you said about, you don't want to make them look stupid. You don't want to shame them in any way.
No,
ask for permission,
not at all.
You're actually bringing down any potential defensiveness, because it's not about shaming them, because that is that reaction, and not making them fearful that they're going to be attacked. You're trying to bridge with them. So you're trying to take the emotion out and try to build a better connection with them, so you can have a more objective conversation, as you mentioned, to get to potentially the root cause of the various things that are happening in the organization.
Right. And let's not forget that there's an order to this. So as I said a few minutes ago, first, we need to understand what their concern sets are, what keeps them up at night, what their measures of success are, what their priorities are. Because once you have permission to give feedback, you need to provide that feedback in the context of, again, just to stay with the same message of making them look good. So, that place of good intention. So before giving feedback, it's always important to understand what we call the value equation is for somebody. What matters most, because then they truly do feel like you're helping them, rather than just voicing feedback to voice feedback, or just sharing something because you just heard it. It might not be a good idea. Back to the timing point. So, these are fundamental elements of really understanding how to manage and navigate through quote office politics and just culture and relationships. That once you learn some of these fundamentals, the earlier that you learn them, we all know, the better, because then over time you can be that partner and really support each other in an organization or on a team at work to get the best work done.
So let's dive into another common power situation that many people have when it comes to their managers, What if your boss wants you to do something and you just don't feel comfortable with it? Or maybe you don't feel it's the right priority? Here's Preston again, followed by Kimberly.
So if a manager asks somebody on his team to do something, that suggests that manager, just in a simple example, suggests that it's a higher level of priority, maybe than something else. So to get back to your question on, how might somebody who's being tasked or asked to do something respond when they feel like it may not be a priority, or they don't understand the thinking behind the prioritization? That you're often in a difficult situation. So the first place I go is, well, is that person in the position to ask questions? And as we know, particularly for inside environments that are politically sensitive, or that there may be a lack of trust, often people are not comfortable asking questions or asking why 5 times, as we always like to say. So what can someone do? I guess the other question is, what can they do if they are not able to ask why?
That is a good point. So yeah, tell us.
So that's where we need to get creative. And so, we use, there's some really great practices out there. There's one particularly around in the context of communicate to influence. Mm-hmm. So there's a training that exists that addresses this. And whether it's spelled out directly in that training or not, the important point is to understand what's the thinking behind the request, or why was the decision made to suggest that this is a priority above something else. And asking smart questions, like, for example, okay, as you're receiving a request, someone can ask, well, can you give me a sense of what success looks like? Or can you share with me what we often call might be the conditions of satisfaction? So in the context of clarifying a request, somebody is surfacing thinking around why that decision was made, that this is now a priority, therefore it's something that I have to do. Or to be even more blunt, if somebody is feeling powerless and tasked or asked to do something, information or the answers to those questions suggest that we can gain a clearer sense of the thinking. So the specific to do is ask good questions to clarify a request, and that might surface more thinking.
Data helps influence. It's really hard to lie with data. And if you can also form alliances with other individuals who have a similar viewpoint as you, so that you can influence your manager, that will typically have, at least if it doesn't sway your manager in the direction that you want, may help open up the conversation. So the other thing that goes into this is there could be some assumptions that are also in play as well, that the manager is closed, that the manager has already made up their mind. And again, when you're able to provide data, when you're able to have folks with similar opinions and go in with that type of an approach, you might find that you've actually had some misconceptions and might be delighted with the outcome.
Another solution is to form alliances with those that may have the same point of view that you do and leverage their support to help shift the dynamics. But there are definitely situations where you won't be able to change the circumstances, at which point you might have to make the decision to leave, particularly if you think by acting upon what is being demanded of you impacts your integrity.
When being a subordinate, regardless of where you are in the organization, I strongly believe that ethical behavior and integrity, right? Integrity is doing the right thing when no one else is looking, right? And having that as part of the threads that are what make you as an individual, those should never be compromised. So be true to yourself. Now, when you find yourself in those positions, which again, I have found myself in those positions, Connie, I know you found yourself in those types of positions because of the experience and the number of years under our belt. However, There are some times when you don't have the power. However, in those situations, the best advice is, how do you enhance your career by looking elsewhere? Quite honestly, if it's something that happens time and time again, that might not be the right organization for you. That might not be the right company for you, depending upon where the politics are. But take those as learning. The other advice that I could give is finding a mentor, finding somebody else within the organization who also espouses the values that you believe in, and that integrity. And they don't need to be a formal mentor. It might simply be somebody with whom you consider a trusted advisor, a trusted individual who also has some experience under their belt and who can help you navigate some of those situations.
Other common situations many of us face are when we're being micromanaged, minimized by your boss or by other team members, or being maneuvered around. For example, when decisions you were intimately involved in that you also felt were finalized are now being undermined and overturned. So what do you do? Kimberly shares her perspective.
So let's go back to two of the common political behaviors or issues that we see in the workplace. First being being navigated around to better someone else's agenda. And the second was having a decision or outcome overturned that you had personally been involved in, which ultimately minimizes your credibility and impact. So how would you say one deals with that situation?
Yeah, I think both of those really, the word that you used was perfect, which is minimizing. Whoever is being undermined or whoever's being navigated around, essentially the message that is sent to the organization around is that, this person is being minimized, that the decision, that the value that they're bringing to the organization isn't necessarily valued, especially by the person who is doing the undermining or the navigating around. There's a couple of different ways that I personally have had to deal with some things like that. I've worked in so many different companies, so many different levels, so many different sizes of the organizations as well. So it's not a one-size-fits-all solution and how to deal with it. But the first thing is awareness. I think that you really need to be honest with yourself and say, well, geez, you know what? Was this really a political motivated move by this individual, or was there something that I could have done that would have made the situation something where I didn't feel like I was being minimized? So the first thing is introspection, and then I think the second thing is really understanding. Okay, can I understand what this person's motivation was? Does it seem like it's truly political? And while I'm being minimized, they're being, I guess to use the antonym is, are they trying to maximize their influence? The best solution in any of these situations, and depending upon the type of person that you are, I know the type of person I am, is to have a conversation with the individual or the group of individuals, because one time it happens, it's a shock. It's something that you really don't want to have repeated as well. So if you can figure out what motivated that individual or those individuals, I think it could help.
One thing you mentioned is about maneuvering. Would you say that that's another way to define what managing the politics are? It's mastering the maneuvering.
It is a little bit of mastering the maneuvering, and mastering the maneuvering. It makes me actually think a little bit more broadly. So when mastering maneuvering, what are you maneuvering? Right? You're maneuvering an organization, you're maneuvering a company, you're maneuvering relationships, and what is involved with each of those nouns, people. And when you think about people, one of the most important things that and one of the best things that you can do for yourself in any organization is get to know the people. Understand them, get to know them as people, get to know them as people, not just as, Joe in finance and, Ashley in procurement and Jeff in product. Really understand, what motivates them, what drives them, who are they? Do they have a sense of humor? Are they dry? Are they, is family the most important thing to them? Are they ultra competitive, right? And then you get a sense of, okay, those are the players on the field. That's what I need to figure out, how I maneuver around. And the thing is as you're getting to know them, they're getting to know you. And I will use the lens of you are an ethical, wanting to be transparent, amicable person who's really there to get the work done and to work together to get things done. If you've been able to successfully network through those organizations and with those people, maneuvering becomes second nature. It doesn't become maneuvering. It becomes having conversations so that you can meet your objective.
Sounds like to me that when you're able to take a step back, look at all the players, all the people who make up the team, who ultimately make up the company, then you start to see that it's not every single person that really has embodied this type of culture that could be the negative side of the culture. It just happens to be that, in that moment, in that situation, they're all moving in that direction. But when you could break it down, understand really what motivates them at their core, you realize that you're able to kind of move people around, understand the strengths and opportunities and maybe some of the weaknesses of those different people on the team to then help you identify the best way to navigate more effectively.
You hit the nail on the head. And before I was talking a little bit about getting to know the people, and I was saying, more personal things about them. But also, what are their objectives? What are they being measured on? What is it that they need to accomplish to make their bonus? Do they know what it is that you need in what you're trying to accomplish and what your goals are? And having that communication absolutely will clarify where you sit within this political structure. Because again, politics are not inherently negative. Politics are simply a matter of being people and having opinions and beliefs and being emotional and having things that you're driving toward. It just encompasses all of that.
Tony reminds us that your approach in dealing with the politics at hand has to be professional. Yet, you also have to stand up for yourself.
As a professional, I would say be balanced. Don't be passive, and don't be overly aggressive. Be professional in your actions. Stand up for yourself. Do so professionally, though. Don't do it in a way that puts others down and undermines others. The old adage of rise above it. If you do it, and you do that consistently, it will really demonstrate your character. And, over time, and it could very well be a short period of time, your character will withstand many of the, what I would call bad politics in the office. Now, that said, you still have to be, I would say, a good politician in the positive sense, right? You've got to know when to speak. You've got to know when to have the one-on-one. You've got to know when to interact with teams of people. And, just remember the things you say may get twisted and repeated. So your interactions are very important to be done in a positive way. Those things done well, you can overcome the majority of politics. You're never going to overcome the bad people. They exist. But from a political standpoint, that would be my advice for overcoming it in the workplace today.
But facing conflict isn't easy for most people. So how do you approach it with confidence?
those who are not conflict adverse, those who feel comfortable, maybe, brokering a conversation that maybe it is out of comfort zone, maybe it isn't out of their comfort zone, but they can broker the conversation and at least try to extend that. I don't know if it's an olive branch necessarily, but to open the dialogue in a negative around a negative situation, they're going to have an easier time. And in my experience, what I have done, and I haven't always done it the best way. It has taken some practice. I practice at home with my husband because it happens all the time there as well. But right, we can all relate to that. But really, once you're able to be the person who begins that dialogue, it automatically puts you in a different place in the pecking order, so to speak. And maybe pecking order is not the right word, but it puts you in a different place in the mind of that individual. Because number one, they now understand that there was something that happened where you felt minimized and there was some type of a maneuvering happening and you really want to talk about it. That right there changes the dynamic of everything. But then the next step is letting that individual speak to the extent that they are willing to have the conversation with you and for you to listen. Because again, you don't know what's motivating them. They could be inherently evil. I don't know. You don't know. But something could be going on where they themselves were minimized. And therefore, the way that they were going about it was to then minimize somebody else because they were able to lift themselves up by pushing others down. And this could potentially also raise their awareness on their behavior. Maybe they weren't even aware of how their behavior was affecting others around them. And therefore, you have the opportunity to bring it into the light. And with that one action, help to potentially change that person's behavior, but then maybe even the culture around them and around you.
Managing up can always be a challenge. The bigger issue is when those who are managing up or kissing up to manipulate the situation and move up the ladder gain favor with those above to your detriment. Jim explains.
You can lose favor in the organization sometimes if you're not paying enough attention to managing up, which, you'd like to think managing up is purely a reflection of how well you do your job, but that's naive. It's not. And so I think, sometimes there are people in organizations who smell weakness and go after that. And they don't necessarily are doing it for the sake of the organization, but they're doing it for the sake of themselves. And that's where I think sometimes it gets bad. You feel like, you're working with people who are peers who you can't necessarily trust to kind of work as a team. So I think that's where it's bad, is when it becomes a personal thing. I think if you look at office politics through the prism of trying to make the organization run more efficiently, then it can be a positive thing.
What do you think the root causes of it are? So for somebody to just look at it more about themselves and gain for themselves versus what you touch about looking at, benefiting an organization, more holistically.
Well, some of it just starts hierarchy of needs. People need to have, there are people who are in a position where they can't afford not to have the job they have, literally. And they need salary, and the fear of losing that salary or having to change jobs, cascades a whole bunch of other fears. So I think a lot of times it's not somebody wakes up in the morning and says, who can I screw over today? No, I don't think the world is full of that many full-on sociopaths. But I think there are people who do it because they recognize that, there might be a reorg coming up soon, and of the three of us, maybe only two of us are going to make it through the reorg, and I got to make sure I'm one of the two. So I don't know that it's necessarily even, and I'm against anybody else. It's just I'm for me, and so it becomes more of a selfishness thing, but often rooted in not unfair things like needing a salary and needing money to raise your family. And so it's my nicest way of putting it is I don't think people or doing it necessarily for terrible reasons. But I do think sometimes people get insecure and decide that, boy, my boss needs to know every single thing I do. And on top of that, he needs to know that I'm doing them well. And on top of that, they need to know they need to know I'm doing them a little bit better than the other guys. And that's where I feel like it starts to get a little dangerous when you start taking other people out along the way.
So if you're on the receiving end of someone's behavior where they are looking out for themselves for the different reasons that you had mentioned, how do you start to manage that? Because obviously those behaviors start to create some very interesting dynamics of
Yes,
which
they
can
do.
create conflicts. But
Yeah,
how would somebody kind of deal with
I
that?
think you try to start with a conversation about it, which is especially if you have an actual thing you can tie it to. If you hear something secondhand that somebody said, you could always go in there and say, hey, I hear you're saying this. If you're not saying it, tell me so. And if you are saying it, tell me why. And let's have a conversation about it, because, organization can't run efficiently if you're telling people things behind my back that you're not telling me in my face. And that may not work. In a lot of cases, it doesn't. And then you have to take a more defensive posture, which is probably spending. And this is where it gets tough, because the people who feel like they're getting pushed down or aren't getting the credit they feel like they deserve decide they have to do that too. And then you end up in a game where everybody's playing to the bosses, and then you can make a case that maybe the work isn't getting done as efficiently as it needs to be because everybody's too busy managing up. And so I think that's why I think it has a cascading effect. I mean, I think all of us at times in our careers, despite whether we think we would do that or not, find yourself in that position where you're having to play a little bit too much office politics. And it's never, for people like me, I'm always like, that's why, to be honest, it's a good part of the reason why I left. Yeah, well, at the end was just a feeling of this isn't worth it. And, I don't want to become somebody I don't like.
Right.
Just being someone running around the office all day trying to say, look at me, look what I'm doing. I mean, my general philosophy is, as a manager and as somebody who is managed, I'd like to be given the freedom to do my job and be held accountable if I don't. But I don't necessarily want to be having to tell my boss every day what I'm doing. And I certainly don't expect people who work for me to come tell me every day what they're doing. So you got to, that's always the decision you have to make sometimes is do you have to, is the only way to succeed to leave the organization rather than be changed by it.
How you communicate is critical to setting the tone for what you want to do, but it's often something people get wrong. Realize that your words, as well as the words your leaders use, can create political complications because they can get misinterpreted. So it's crucial for you to understand how the delivery of your intent gets translated. So be professional and have self-awareness as a leader and employee. Here's Tony and Preston with their advice.
When you are communicating and the words you use, they do have impact. And when you put the political bend on it, those words can have what I would call intended consequences or unintended consequences. Intended may be influencing to have a decision go the way you want it, right? That's an intended consequence. Unintended consequence would be you didn't use the right words or it didn't go the way you wanted, and the outcome is disruptive and it's not aligned to your preferences and desires in the business. The words you use are truly important because they have consequences, both intended and unintended, and that is a bit of politics.
Whether you're a man or a woman, you need to understand your preferences and skills and styles. And then once you acknowledge and are aware of them, you need to communicate them. So, if I do know that I need to work on, quote, listening, because I've gotten some feedback that I'm not very empathetic and I talk more than I listen. Well, we need to create an environment where it's safe for me to say, you know what, I'm working on becoming a better listener. Let me just take a moment. And then, of course, you have a support network of colleagues that will support you in improving on that thing that you need to improve upon.
Absolutely. Well, but I also take away on the flip side is that if you're in an environment where you have, you've got these different leaders and they have various communication styles, that's just the way it is. They may not be self-aware, they may be self-aware, but the key point that I also walk away with as well is that once you're able to understand their style of communication and the way that they deliver, they may have the same intent. It's just the way they deliver their intent is different. And how people read the intent obviously can create interesting complications in the interpretation and can trigger actions that aren't necessarily what was intended from the beginning, right? That can cause a whole domino effect. So I kind of see the flip side.
Yeah.
There's one, obviously working with the leader to help them improve their communication style so that folks can understand it. But when you're in the reverse situation where they may not have the self-awareness, then how do you deal with what you have? Which is going back to, your earlier point of you're creating these personas, you really understand the ins and outs of the person, and that's not just, what could be going on with them individually, but knowing the way that they deliver their message. And if that's consistent, then you have a better understanding of what they're really saying and not misinterpreting what it could be too.
Exactly. And it goes back to that, my favorite word, permission. If you're working with a leader or a manager that may not have that level of self-awareness, the feedback is, I feel like I don't have permission to give feedback, to give you the feedback you need. I feel like I don't have permission to set you up to be successful. That's hard to hear for anyone. And
yeah, absolutely.
In a good way, in a good way, right? It's very interesting. I've seen this happen, and I've seen it really shift the dynamics in a relationship, both in terms of one-on-one relationships and team environments where, if you're tasked with being a leader or manager and you're getting feedback that you're not aware of the things you need to work on. And not only that, but that's probably because you don't have not given permission to your team to help you be successful and help you look good. That's a big deal. And when that dynamic is shifted, and when the right conversations happen, once somebody, people managers in particular, get that feedback, that one thing, in my experience, is the biggest success factor for shifting culture, eliminating politics and improving culture.
Also realize when is a good time to have the conversation. And as Tony explains, you need to have that EQ to help determine when that time is. And when you do, be brief and choose your words carefully. And another thing you mentioned earlier was this whole thing about, in order to be a good politician, it's knowing when to speak. Timing is important. How does somebody identify what that right timing may be?
The immediate thought that I've got is, you got to sit back, especially when you enter a new job in a new company or a new role in an existing company. And you've got to pick up on the politics, right? You got to pick up on, who the clans and cliques are, who's got power by title, who's got power by influence, who are some of the positive influencers, some of the negative influencers. And what that does is it really feeds kind of that emotional quotient, right? That emotional intelligence that you need to really be astute through observation and know instinctively and sometimes courageously when it's the right time to speak. And then when you do speak, you should be as brief as you can. And as we were saying earlier, right, high impact, choose your words carefully. Mean what you say.
EQ is not something that is immediate or innate in some. How would you teach somebody to build that EQ so that they can be astute, as you had mentioned before?
Yeah, it kind of goes back to the comments I made earlier about flipping it a bit and thinking about leadership and mentorship, right? Especially for the millennials today, they'll leave jobs, before the average 2.5 years if the political tax is high. They really want to come to work to learn, and they want to work for somebody that's going to grow and mentor them. So I would speak to the leaders and managers out there listening to this podcast and say, if you see a lack of EQ and emotional intelligence in your people, regardless of their age or role, you should strive and help to develop that, right? Because it is not something that you can read a book on and innately you're emotionally intelligent. It really comes through experience. So experiential coaching and teaching, I believe, Connie, is the best way to develop that in people. That's how I developed my EQ. I I still am learning every day, but I had good mentors along the way, and I picked them carefully. And by the way, if your leader, your manager is not a great mentor, go ask somebody else to be your mentor, even outside the business.
I 100% agree with that I had a very similar experience where it wasn't something that was immediately caught for me, or it was necessarily innate, but I had some amazing mentors who taught me along the way. And it was learning through observation, but it was also learning through discussion where they could provide feedback and context and do sort of somewhat scenarios and explaining it to me in a way that I could understand how the behavior would link to outcomes, and help me understand how you would play things out. But totally agree is that it's not something where, you realize, wow, EQ is just as important as IQ in the workplace.
Yeah. I mean, my first experience with it, I was very young in business. And my manager at the time had, pulled me into the office and said, "Hey, do you always just say what you think?" And I kind of, looked at her and I was like, I think so. I guess so. And she's like, "You can't do that. What you just did to Sally, you came across as a-hole. And it was offensive." And, I took stock in that. And from that moment forward, it was just that one conversation, Connie, that put me on the path of understanding that it's not just what I learned, technically to do my job and, leadership principles, that there's a social human aspect to it. And that's when I committed to, finding the right people to help me develop that side of my people interaction in the workplace.
Jim echoes that EQ is critical to you understanding how to manage the politics, because even though you may have an overarching approach to how you engage with your team or others, not everyone else responds, interacts, or activates in the same way.
I do think you have to set the strategy on high, and then you have to be very, very focused on the emotional IQ part of how relationships work. And then if you can do those two things well, I think the work, which kind of sits between those two things, will be good, because you understand how the place works and you've set a strategy. People understand. If you do those two things, kind of the high and the low, I feel like the middle takes care of itself.
So what exactly is emotional IQ or EQ?
It's being able to understand what's going on around you without processing it through your own insecurities and your own fears, right? It's just understanding what is happening and kind of being able to block out the parts of it that might affect you. So one of the things I've always felt pretty good about skill-wise myself is I feel like I can walk into a room and read it fast. Nobody says a word, but you can just feel a room is this is not the right day to make this announcement that I need to make in the next 2 weeks, but today's not the day. I can just feel there's something awry in the room. I don't know whether it's a hard news day and people are depressed, or it's a Monday and everybody's sad to be back at work after a fun weekend. I don't know what it is, but I just feel like it's not the right time to do this, and I'm going to wait till Wednesday to do it or whatever. And but some people walk into that room and everybody seems down and they're just well, what's wrong with these people? And they take it personally. Why are they not, I'm the boss. Why are they not, reacting the way I want them to react? So part of it is just trying to keep yourself out of it, your own insecurities out of it. And it's a lesson father taught me a long time ago, my father was in management for a long time and always said that 80% of the time when somebody's upset or in your face about something, it's not about you, it's about them. So if you react as if it's about you, you're not going to be able to solve the problem. If you can take a breath and just listen to what they're saying and hear it outside of your own filter, you can help. If you start getting mad, you start getting angry, and you start taking it personally, the odds that you're going to fix it go way down. So I've always tried to carry that, which is if you walk into a room and it feels like a bad room, maybe it is my fault. I don't know, but I'm going to figure it out. And the only way I can figure it out is not to sit here and get emotional about it or get angry or whatever. It's just I just have to ask questions and try to elicit some answers as to why things feel the way they feel without even asking the question, why do you feel this way? You have to ask questions that are sort of indirect questions to get at that. So I think part of it is just, emotional intelligence is just being able to keep yourself out of something sometimes so you can hear others, which I definitely know is not the Merriam-Webster definition.
So what happens when you read all the tea leaves and still no one is showing up in a way that's beneficial to the organization? It becomes that me versus we culture. So in those instances where essentially what you're talking about is kind of a cultural dynamic of an organization where if one person isn't standing up, showing up in the way that is beneficial for the organization, then you have this domino effect that everyone starts to look out for themselves. So what advice would you have for folks who don't want to necessarily maybe leave, but how can they start to set that trend and be maybe that upstander and demonstrate kind of the right behavior and play positive politics, so to speak?
Yeah, I mean, it obviously depends on where you sit in that organization. I'll tell you that's not easy. If it starts at the top, if you have a CEO of the company and he or she is generally somewhat insecure themselves and want a lot and create that culture, unless the CEO goes, it's highly unlikely it's going to change. So, you could always try to have that conversation, but by the time, maybe unless you're talking about somebody who starts their own thing and they're 21 years old, most people have gotten to CEO level or been around long enough that their personality is their personality. And the odds that one day they're just going to wake up and go, geez, you're right, I got to be a totally different person. And boom, they do it. I'd say that's a pretty rare example where that happens. So, but I think you always try to, try to find the highest person you trust on the org chart who you think mirrors the behavior that you'd like to see and try to have that conversation. And then I guess you can get to see how powerful that person is. And if they can affect some change, great. Yeah. Stick it out. If they can't, start looking for another place to work. And I think I got to think in a lot of cases, if you were ranking the reasons people leave workplaces, a lot of it is culture and office politics and things like that. So I think it's hard to change. I think, I would say, I hate to be the naysayer, but if you're in a position where, if you're in that position, I'd say you got a 20% shot that things are going to change dramatically, and probably an 80% shot you're going to have to leave.
So it's almost evaluating those circumstances and rank ordering, like what is my ability to truly create that change for myself and the organization in the way that I want to. And based on that, then kind of evaluate what's the right next path.
Yeah, and you can try to organize too. You can try to organize staff to say, look, there's 15 of us who feel the same way. Let's get together and make sure that we air these things out to senior management. There certainly is power in numbers, in the sense that if 20% of your organization is signing a letter saying this culture has to change, no company wants to have 20% of its people walk out the door. If nothing else, just because of the chaos it brings to the operation, much less the bad press that might come with it, depending on how famous the company is or how well known the company is.
Preston adds that it's all about creating transparency to create an inclusive organization.
It's similar but a different question. But ultimately, you're getting to the root of the issue, which is there will be more politics when there's less transparency and there's less of a feedback culture, right? Because people aren't responding to feedback if they're not getting it, and that's typically not a good thing. That's a sign of a healthy organization when you can bring that level of transparency, and ultimately that's what inclusion really is when you think about it. We talk about one of my pet peeves is when people talk about diversity and inclusion as though it's the same thing.
We've talked about several strategies and tactics to help you address the common challenges that those of us in the workplace encounter, all with the intent of accomplishing various goals that include being heard, having influence over a decision, feeling empowered, and being in control. So what other positive political behaviors should we think about? Let's hear from Jim, Jen, and JT. Jim first talks about the importance of learning about the power centers as a leader to help manage politics.
Yeah, well, I think, look, the first thing I did when I got the job running WashingtonPost.com was take every single person on staff. We had 110 or something in the newsroom, every one of them out to coffee in the first 60, 90 days I was in the job. And it wasn't direct reports only. It was every single person who worked in the newsroom. And part of that was to just spend a little time with each of them individually, find out kind of their career path to that point, what's working, what's not working here. But, one of the things you get out of those conversations is you start to recognize, as I mentioned earlier, who carries more power than their org chart position would suggest, and who might carry less. And so by figuring out kind of how you can map out an organization like that, that if I want to make a big change in the newsroom, if I test it on these three kind of mid-level managers or even junior people, I know that they're the ones who can affect the most. They give me the almost honest feedback, but they also have an outsized impact on the newsroom. And so if I get floating it to them and giving them some ability to weigh in earlier, you can kind of get a sense of how it might play in the larger. So part of it is just understanding power dynamics and who has sort of, as I said, sort of inherited power earned power rather than just inherited power.